session of the ELSI Dialogues. My name is Janet Delgado from the University of Granada, Department of Philosophy 1, and I am part of the Work Package 2 Ethics and Governance team for the TTV Guide Transplant project. I will be moderating this discussion, which will be recorded and made available online. Today, we are going to be exploring the most recent research, development considerations, and effective approaches for integrating sex and gender into medical research. Before we dive in, I want to let you know that this session is a collaborative effort between BBM-RI Eric's ELSI team and TTV Guide Transplant, a project funded by European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. The goal of the TTV Guide Transplant is to establish a tool to guide immunosuppression by quantifying the activity of the torquetenovirus, TTV, in kidney transplant recipients. Within a randomized control clinical trial, including hundreds of kidney transplant recipients from all over Europe, TTV-guided dosing of immunosuppressive drugs is being tested. Once established in routine clinical care, the hope is that TTV guidance will reduce infections and kidney transplant rejection. Visit ttvguide.eu, that is ttv-uuide.eu, for more information. As part of the project, the Work Package 2 wants to promote best practices in the inclusion of sex and gender in clinical research. And that is why this collaboration with BBM-RI ELSI team was established for co-organizing this session of ELSI Dialogues. Now let's begin. The medical community is moving on a path towards more personalized and effective medical treatment and therapies for everyone. In doing so, it is crucial to integrate sex and gender into research, as it has the potential to fuel structural and systematic change. For example, considering gender factors such as social, cultural, and economic influences can help address health disparities and improve health outcomes for all individuals. Today, we will explore how providing the research community with the resources and information needed to include sex and gender factors into their work will result in more inclusive and impactful results. We will be examining this topic from the perspective of researchers and healthcare professionals, and we will discuss subject areas including artificial intelligence applications and nephrology. Guiding our webinar on this topic are experts from BBM-RI Eric. Melanie Goisauf is a senior scientist and a member of the ELSI team in several research projects and leads BBM-RI Ethics of Artificial Intelligence Lab. Her research focus is on ethical, social, and societal aspects of biobanking, in particular on governance and stakeholder engagement, as well as gender, knowledge production, and artificial intelligence. Mónica Cano Abadía holds various roles at BBM-RI. In addition to being a senior scientist, Mónica is the deputy head of the ELSI Research Department, and she is the gender equality and diversity specialist. Her research focus is the analysis of ethical and societal aspects of artificial intelligence in medicine, especially concerning matters of trustworthiness. Welcome to the webinar, everyone, and thank you for giving your time and expertise on this important topic. Please use the chat box to write your questions. I will read them on your behalf once the session finishes. Mónica Cano Abadía is going to.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here with us today. We are very happy to be presenting this webinar on the incorporation of sex and gender in medical research. Next slide, please. First, as Janet, who kindly invited us for this webinar today in this collaboration, said before, we work at the ELSI Services and Research Department at BBMRI ERIC, and we do research, we provide services, and we also do training such as this webinar. So we use the knowledge that we gain in research projects to provide training, and we are very happy to be here with this one today. Next slide, please. The contents, some of the contents of this webinar today stem from another collaboration that we were lucky enough to have a few months ago with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and within the project EOS Clive. We organized this Train the Trainer that was called Integrating the Sex and Gender Dimension in Life Sciences Research. And through this collaboration, we produced a handbook, which will be made available online very soon. We are still in the making, but very soon, if you stay tuned, we will circulate a link with the handbook. And this handbook provides tools and guidance on basically the didactics of how teaching how to integrate the sex and gender dimension in the life sciences research. So some of the contents that we will present here today, especially the beginning of this webinar, will also be available in this handbook. Next slide, please. So into the topic already. When it comes to the definitions of sex and gender, health experts frequently use these terms, sex and gender, interchangeably. For example, in one of the papers that we will present later, that it's a literature review that aims at understanding the use of sex and gender in the field of transplant research, they state that the terms sex and gender were applied interchangeably in more than half of the studies that they analyzed. Nonetheless, academics and policymakers that support the inclusion of sex and or gender in health encourage people to draw distinctions between the two, because there are analytical distinctions that are very important in the field. When it comes to definition and gender, we can have a look at this definition that the Canadian Institutes of Health Research has issued, which I consider is pretty complete, although about gender you can write. And in fact, there's a lot of research done on just the definition of gender, but we can have a look at this one right now. So gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. It influences how people perceive themselves and each other, how they act and interact, and the distribution of power and resources in society. Gender identity is not confined to a binary, girl, woman on the one hand and boy, man on the other hand, nor it is static. It exists along a continuum and can change over time. There is a considerable diversity in how individuals and groups understand, experience, and express gender through the roles they take on. So gender underpins social roles in the home, in the workplace, in political and religious arenas, and it is thus multidimensional and complex, and may include women, men, and non-binary people. Next slide, please. When it comes to sex, we can have a look at the definition by the same institution, which states that sex refers to a set of biological attributes in humans and animals. It is primarily associated with physical and physiological features, including chromosomes, gene expression, hormone levels and function, and reproductive / sexual anatomy. Sex is usually categorized as female or male, but there is a variation, as we will see later, in the biological attributes that comprise sex and how these attributes are expressed. So it is also something that, as we see, is quite complex and quite multidimensional. Next slide, please. So why do these definitions matter? Here we have an example of an institution that has aimed at integrating a more complex definition of sex and gender, and they stated in 2018 in their policies to affirm that the medical spectrum of sex and gender, they state sex and gender are more complex than previously assumed. It is essential to acknowledge that an individual's gender identity may not align with the sex assigned to them at birth. For example, women does not necessarily align with female attributes, and men does not necessarily align with male attributes. A narrow limit of the definition of sex would have public health consequences for the transgender population and individuals born with differences in sexual differentiation, also known as intersex traits. Also, the European Commission has announced in 2020, in late 2020, that their research grant recipients need to incorporate analysis that include sex and gender dimensions in their study design. It is compulsory from 2020, and these can include disaggregating data by sex when examining, for example, cells, or also considering how a technology might perpetuate gender stereotypes. Another example is, for example, one of the leading medical journals, The Lancet, also has updated their author guidelines very recently, encouraging the enrollment of women and ethnic groups into clinical trials and to analyze the data accordingly, considering the influences and associations of sex and gender. So there is also an institutional atmosphere that is fostering this integration of sex and gender in research, in medical research. Next slide. The complexity of sex and gender is one of the aspects that complicates the integration of sex and gender in medicine. Usually the category of sex that refers to anatomical features has been presented within a binary understanding of sex. Nonetheless, there is also individuals that prove that this sex binary is an oversimplification of integrate biological and physiological variation that are observed in human beings. There exists a possibility of intersex individual who possess diverse anatomical features or exhibit chromosomal variations. So these binary classifications often fail to accommodate the vast spectrum of gender identities, and there's an aim to integrate a broad and diverse consideration of the category of sex in medical research. In this sense, we invite you to watch a webinar that we organized last year on the complexity of sex determination with Amanda Montañez, who created this amazing infographic on the complexity of sex determination. Next slide. Which is very big, very complex, and very informative. And she explains in the webinar the process of generation of this, of research and generation of this infographic, and how complex she realized that sex determination was. I invite everyone to look it up. It's called Beyond X and XY, and it is really interesting to spend some time reading the details. It's very small written here, so you probably cannot read anything. So I invite everyone to spend some time with it, because it's really informative, and it's really eye-opening how the biological science behind sex usually is presented to us in a very in a very clear way. There's this category, there's that category, but it can be way more complicated than that. Next slide, please. To complicate it a little bit more, then sex and gender interact with each other, and they also interact with other factors, such as other biological factors and other sociocultural factors in very complex ways. So in practice, sex and gender are not static categories, but very dynamic categories that are in constant dialogue with one another and with other categories that, or even anatomical features. So it is quite complicated there as well. One fascinating example is the experience of reporting pain in Western cultures. And it's a good example of how sex and gender interact, but my colleague Melanie will dig a little bit more into that. So the understanding of how sex and gender interact with each other and intersect with other biological and socio-cultural factors can enhance the quality of science, health, and medicine in several ways. For example, it can help researchers identify and address health disparities that affect different populations. It can develop more effective treatments and interventions that take into account sex and gender differences. It can improve the accuracy and generalizability of research findings, and it can help healthcare providers to deliver a more personalized and more patient-centered approach to care, which takes into consideration the unique needs and experiences of different individuals based on their different attributes. So ultimately, integrating sex and gender into scientific research can contribute to better health outcomes and improved quality of life for all individuals. Next slide, please. Why is it important to integrate the dimensions of sex and gender into medical research? It is important in order to identify differences in health outcomes and treatment responses between diverse sexes, which in different fields of medicine can be varying. It is helpful to avoid generalizing research findings from males to females and non-binary people, which is a tendency that has been happening, and Melanie will delve into that later. It is helpful also to understand how sex and gender impact disease manifestation and progression, and to develop more personalized and effective treatments for everyone, men, women, trans, and non-binary people. Additionally, it is important to promote health equity by providing tailored healthcare that is based on sex and gender differences when it is relevant, and to improve the overall quality of research by accounting for the impact of sex and gender on health outcomes. Additionally, it is important to integrate a diverse and broad understanding of sex and gender, as I said earlier, so that it fosters the inclusion of everyone and contributes to an accurate representation of human diversity. This would help addressing health disparities and promoting ethical research practices while advancing social progress, and above all, enhance scientific rigor, because human diversity should also be represented in medical research. So this is a matter, the integration of sex and gender, and furthermore, a diverse and broad understanding of the categories of sex and gender is a matter of the accuracy of data, and is a matter of the quality of data and the research outcomes of medical research. And for now, I will hand over to my colleague Melanie, which will continue with the next section.
Okay, thank you, Mónica, for this introduction and bringing us to the topic of sex and gender and the importance in medicine, and the complex way we are thinking about sex and gender and how sex and gender interact today, especially also in medicine. This is, of course, nothing new, the way we also arrived to that point, how we understand it today. So it's already a key part of the history of medicine, but that's one where women in particular were absent. So historically, women have been excluded from medical trials and research studies, which has had significant implications for the understanding and treatment of health conditions. And this happened in a way that biomedical research was long done on male animal models and cells, and medical trials were conducted with a, so to say, standard human, that is middle-aged white men in most cases, and that built the basis for what we call evidence-based medical knowledge. So differences, for instance, between and within sex and gender, and we heard that this is a really complex matter, were left out in the interest of homogeneity or were simply not analyzed. So, and this exclusion has been driven by a number of factors, including concerns about potential harms to women of childbearing age, as well as lack of recognition of the unique ways that women's bodies may respond to medical treatments. However, this exclusion has also meant that many medical treatments and interventions have been developed and tested primarily on men, with limited understanding of how they may affect women differently. So sex classification does not seem to be solely a matter of biology, and sex categories have changed throughout the history of science. And what we also see then in the history of medicine, so to say, is that the anatomical knowledge of the sex body was largely informed by cultural understandings about gender differences. Next slide, please. And I want to give you some examples about this last point, about this cultural understanding has been inscribed in medical knowledge. And with these examples also within the images, anatomical images that were also used at that time. And there were supposedly universal representations of the human body in the 18th and 19th century, and especially in these illustrations. But in fact, they were loaded with a lot of cultural values and cultural understandings. So what you see on the left-hand side is an image by images by John Barclay, who also gives this representation, and there was clearly also an emphasis on how this was represented. So it's also a matter of style, so to say, we would say nowadays. And also in the comparison to animal skeletons, which would then highlight the distinctive features of the male skeleton on the left-hand side and the female one on the right-hand side. And here you can see a little bit, I hope you can see it, that the male skeleton was compared to a horse because of its strength, and the female one to an ostrich because of it represents somehow a large pelvis and long, narrow neck. And what you can also see in comparison of these two skeletons is, for example, the skulls. So the female head is very small compared to the male one, and also the shoulders and is different. So there are really different representations about like the skeletons would look like. On the right-hand side on the top, you see a picture that is mentioned in this book. I would say Mónica would agree, would highly recommend to read, from Thomas Laqueur, Making Sex. So kind of the history of how sex was, how to say, invented throughout also the histories. And what you can see on that picture is actually female body parts. So the uterus and vagina of a woman were seen as isomorphic to the penis. So that should actually represent female body parts, but it's exactly kind of the opposite to what we're seeing for men. So also kind of the cultural understanding or a whole worldview that makes this look like this represents how the thinking was back then. And we're talking here about the Renaissance. So the illustrators back then learned also how to depict the female genitalia from other pictures and not from nature alone. Was not like the procedure in that time. So they took other pictures to reproduce that kind of picture. And that's in fact an interesting procedure also when we reflect on our practices today, which I will talk about a little bit later. I just also included also on the right-hand side a different kind of source to explore this further, because it's not only that people directly involved in medical or science thought a lot about sex and differences in male and female sex, and this is very nicely and very entertaining represented in Liv Strömquist's graphic novel, where she showed where there were actually a lot of men that have been too interested in these differences, and how they shaped also understandings about how the differences are made, which had then also really real world effects on women, how this was seen. So also a recommendation for this book. So next slide, please. So much about history. So what about today? So we see that while classifications, of course, have evolved historically, it's not the way that we think the same way about sex differences as we did in the Renaissance. They have an impact on how modern biomedical research practice is shaped and conducted. So we are not free of all these cultural understandings. They are still, to a certain extent, inscribed in how we understand these differences. So gender can influence the therapies that are offered to patients, and sex is directly linked to certain bodily functions that have to do with health, as it refers to the biological attributes that distinct male, female, and or intersex according to the function that derive from chromosomes, reproductive organs, specific hormones, or environmental factors. And also, in a way, as Mónica described, how they interact in that is that sex bias can lead to a gendered perspective of diseases. A very prominent example in that is heart disease, which has for a long time been primarily understood or seen as the male disease. And standards have been created based on kind of male on males, and the outcomes of studies also on that. So women and gender diverse individuals were often mis or underdiagnosed. I think this is also very known, that heart attacks and so on, and the symptoms which are shown differently were not seen in the same way also. And this led and could lead also to health disparities and inequalities in healthcare. Next slide, please. And this is the example Mónica mentioned before about pain. And we want to make you aware of this website. On the right-hand side, this is a QR code. So just follow the dinosaur to this really interesting project, where you can find a couple of really interesting examples about how this happened and what has happened, and also what steps can be taken. So when it comes to pain, and especially chronic pain, sex and gender interact and affect all parts of the pain pathway. So from signaling to perception to expression and treatment. And this has then also to do, of course, with gender, so understood as the more social, societal, social component. Here is that men and women are also raised to express pain differently, which may also modify their biological response to pain and their willingness to report it, and also how they report it. And also when it comes to biology, there have been differences found also in testosterone, for instance, and estrogens that are connected to that. And while in both cases the result is increased sensitivity to pain, there are still differences. So the pathways are different. And this could mean that this could have implication for drug discovery or drug development. So further research is also then needed here. Next slide, please. So what is suggested on the website for this case study in how to gender these innovations is that studying the underlying biological mechanisms of pain in female typical bodies and male typical bodies may also promote sex-specific treatments. So also a closer look into that would be necessary, and how this influence all that, as mentioned, maybe to design sex-tailored pain treatments. The second innovation that suggests is that studying how sex and gender interact and how sex and sex interact is also would also be necessary to consider, as I said, because men, women, boys, girls are socialized also differently when it comes to pain, and this also impacts the sensitivity to pain and the reporting of pain. And yeah, also then all the reporting also when it comes to the studying pain. And the third innovation mentioned is the understanding how gender impacts the reporting and treatment of pain, especially when it comes to these gendered stereotypes. And also when it comes to the healthcare professionals in dealing that, how they kind of see pain differently, or the reporting of pain differently in men and women, for instance. The second dinosaur that appeared on the slide is leads to a very interesting webinar we had previously, which is on this gendered innovations on this project, and also highly recommended to look into that also for more examples in that direction. Next slide, please. So today also sex and gender differences are documented for major diseases such as heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, COVID-19, as well as the efficiency and side effect of drugs. And what you can see here is an overview of recent research on women's health and sex-related differences in disease, which can be found on the Nature website. So this is a Nature collection where you can find many studies that shows how differences actually make a difference, in a way that this difference needs to be considered to have a better outcomes and to do better, stronger research that considers all that. So that's also highly recommended to visit this website and yeah, to see what, or to see that there's actually already a lot of things going on in these diseases, in considering gender, sex and gender, and when it comes to disease. Next slide, please. So what is also, of course, a topic for today's knowledge production, and especially also biomedical knowledge production, it's described more in the social science perspective at the datafication of health and the ways how we categorize sex and gender and how we use that also in research. So this is a picture of a chapter from the book Data Feminism. And I think the headline here is telling a lot already. What gets counted counts. So what with the categories or classifications that we made, this is then all that we see, and then we count and include them also in research. So categorizations and classifications, I use that interchangeably for also today, take a central role in database knowledge production. So in speaking of what gets counted counts means here that data must be classified to be processed, and it must be put in some kind of category. By the time that information becomes data or is translated into data, it's already then being classified. And this raises the question, who is counted, who gets in, who is involved, who benefits then by the end from a technology, and who is maybe overlooked. So what's the missing data then in all that? I also want to point to other books, since this is a training, I guess, further readings. might be of interest to you. So one is by Booker and Starr, Sorting Things Out. And in this book, the authors explore how classification systems shape our understanding of the world and how they can have unintended consequences. And they also illustrate how classification systems can reinforce existing power structures and marginalize certain groups. And categories like gender, race, sexuality, class, we're focusing today on sex and gender, but of course there are other categories, have become key classifications for the study of society and in understanding the reproduction also of social order within society. But also how we see all that through this lens of categorization or classification. For instance, the ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases, a statistical classification, and diseases that are statistically relevant are included here. And in this book, they show in a really good way how this changed also over time with every new version, how we changed also our classifications or understandings of diseases. And the third book you can see here on the slide is from Epstein, called Inclusion, the Politics of Differences in Medical Research. And here the author looks into how medical research has historically excluded certain groups, particularly women and people of color, from clinical trials and other studies. And the author argues that this exclusion has led to a lack of understanding about how different groups experience disease and respond to treatment. And all these categories I've mentioned have also taken kind of a new importance, so to say, within modern medicine, especially with data-fied biomedical and health research. So altogether, the takeaway from these three books would be what gets counted, classified, categorized counts get included or not, transformed and reproduced in biomedical research and development. So we always need also to reflect in how we measure things and define things and how we classify them. And next slide, please. To give you an example about that, I want to point you here to a paper coming from our team, and which you can find on the right-hand side, called Moving Back to the Future of Big Data-Driven Research, reflecting on the social in genomics, where we then ask on the example of this of a large-scale genome-wide association studies on same-sex sexual behavior, how the social is inscribed, reproduced, included also there. In doing research. And this illustrates then also how science and society are co-produced in research, and how underlying social classifications and categorizations can be incorporated into knowledge production. So that was not only a practice, so to say, back then, it's also happening also in today's research. And for what's interesting also here to point out is that, and this is all mentioned also in the study, that the authors have made a couple of reductive assumptions, which is mentioned in the limitations of these studies. But for instance, what you can see here lighted, they acknowledge that the research is based on a binary sex system with exclusions of non-compliant groups, as the authors report that they have been dropped individuals from the studies whose biological sex and self-identified sex gender did not match. So both categorizing sexual orientations is also mainly done here, so to say, in practice rather than attraction or desire, and in building it on normative assumptions about sexuality, which means in that case gender binary and heteronormativity, which could also be problematic as sexual behavior is diverse and does not necessarily correspond with such assumptions. And I wanted to use these examples to show that although there is research on the biology, so to say, or the genetics of that going on, but there is still also a social practice in a way that decisions are made in how certain groups get in or excluded. And I think in that example, it's really interesting that in a research about sexuality, groups that are outside, so to say, or excluded from the gender binary are excluded to learn about the complexity of sexuality. So that was really short about this study. So next slide, please. So let's look a little bit to tomorrow, but I mean, in that way, tomorrow is happening today already. And so big data and artificial intelligence in medicine. So with this increasing datification of health, big amounts of digital data are generated inside and outside the medical context. For example, health records, wearable data from smartwatches and so on, and also cohort data and so on. And this data is, of course, being also reused. And this is, in terms of large amount of data, it's estimated that up to 30% of the entire world's stored data is health-related data. So really a large amount. And this is, of course, often used, secondarily used in this research, and then treated, so to say, often as raw data. And yeah, for social scientists, this doesn't exist in that way. So raw data is an oxymoron, is one of the kind of famous quotes here, also meaning that data is never produced free of theoretical framings, methodological decisions, and technological conditions. So building on that data is never kind of built on this raw data, especially in further uses or reuses of data, because this data have been collected in a certain way and is then merged also in big data-based research with other sources of data, which require harmonization. And here we are again with how decisions are made, how data gets harmonized. And we see also here different developments or transformation going on, while we see a strong tendency also to open up and to consider more diversity and to include more groups in the practices of data reuse and harmonization. Of course, you have to work then with the kind of data you have. So we see then also that we are going back to the usual categories in that way. And how this data is also used is also then linked to technological advancements in the medical field, in particular artificial intelligence applications, which means here that, of course, to build AI, it needs to be trained with certain data. And so if you feed AI with this data and the categorizations and assumptions we are using on that, of course, AI is then working with it. And so I used also an image here, I think, which shouldn't be the future in doctors focusing more and more on data and not so much on the patient, but also using an image again to remind you on what was said earlier about how things got reused hundreds of years ago by producing new images based on other images. And I think we should reflect also in how we produce data, health data, or knowledge, building on other kinds of data, and how this is then used and which kind of decisions are made, and that are then ultimately also used to train artificial intelligence. So the message here would be that with the emergence of these big data sets, algorithms, medical AI, these imaginaries or understanding of standards or standardized bodies and the categories that are used or ignored become even more important also here. And the next slide, please. to give you also an idea that, of course, there is research and awareness on bias, also gender bias, but then it's still complex. These topics, bias is not the same as bias in most of the cases. So what we want to have for artificial intelligence is understanding differences better in a kind of strive for more personalized or medicine, and to consider that as mentioned for the development of treatments and diagnosis and healthcare in general, for the well-being of the patients. But what we should avoid is, of course, this stigma, discrimination, underrepresentation of certain societal groups. So there needs to be a good balance in to produce also better outcomes. And with that, I hand over back to Mónica.
Thank you, Melanie. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to show a few papers, also for further reading. All of them have their associated QR code without dinosaur, so that you can have a look at them and read them more thoroughly. But I will give some insights on the integration of sex and gender that has already been done in the field of nephrology and transplant research. This particular paper that tries to integrate a gender perspective into nephrology starts by stating that the field of nephrology has largely ignored this gender perspective approach, and that there's not many studies that have been investigating scientific evidence in this regard. Nonetheless, there is, they refer to a recent study that has been conducted in Spain, where they show that chronic kidney disease shows differences between genders in both prevalence and rate of progression. Additionally, also in treatment and health outcomes. So understanding the differences that gender brings into the field is relevant because there are reported differences already. As they state, chronic kidney disease shows differences in prevalence according to gender because there is higher prevalence in women, in evolution because there is a faster progression in men than in women, and prognosis. Young women on dialysis increase their non-cardiovascular mortality and lose the survival advantage over men in general population. This greater prevalence of chronic kidney disease in women may be due to the longer life expectancy of women. They achieve, thus, the risk age of chronic kidney disease, or it could be also due to the inaccuracy of the formulas that estimate certain measures, certain indicators that measure how well the kidneys are functioning, such as glomerular filtration rate. So if there is inaccuracy of the formulas applied to women, that could be a source of bias that is introduced there, and that could account for this greater prevalence of chronic kidney disease in women. They also state in this study that the application of a gender perspective improves the scientific rigor and the reproducibility of clinical trials by identifying and addressing gender biases that can exist in the design and the conduct and analysis of clinical trials. So integrating this perspective of, in particular, the case of, they talk about, they use the term gender, can lead to a more accurate and reliable result when it comes to understanding the different populations based on gender. So this perspective may provide clues that could lead also, they state, to new pharmacological targets and treatment strategies. by identifying differences that could be gender specific and that could be important to identify when it comes to disease mechanisms, risk factors, and treatment responses. So they conduct here a study trying to invite people to integrate this perspective in a field that they identify is lacking this perspective. Next slide, please. This second study that I would like to present, it's called the Underrepresentation of Women in Recent Landmark Kidney Trials. The Gender Gap Prevails. So the title is already telling us a result of their study. That is the underrepresentation of women, and they focus also on the analysis of how certain medications are have shown significant benefits for kidney disease patients, but there are concerns about potential sex differences when it comes to the effects of these agents. And these potential differences have not been sufficiently studied. So this stems, as they state in this study, from the underrepresentation of women in clinical trials, including cardiovascular and nephrology trials. So this underrepresentation of women in clinical trials leads to insufficient data when it comes to assessing the potential sex disparate effects of pharmacological agents that treat kidney disease patients. They also state that there's some differences when it comes to gender, because women may perceive more harm from trial participation and are generally, they state, more risk adverse under stress and have been shown to be more reluctant than men to participate in clinical trials. Additionally, there is some exclusion criteria, different ones than the Melanie was stating, but in this case, they talk about people of childbearing age may be excluded from the study design due to the potential for pregnancy and or breastfeeding. And they state how it is necessary to develop a gender-sensitive recruitment toolbox for including patient and investigators that can engage in engagement and communication strategies that are gendered. So they consider that they need to introduce somehow this desirable bias when it comes to fostering more inclusion of women in clinical trials. And they develop some strategies to bolster the recruitment of women in clinical trials and to ensure the adequate representation of women in clinical trials and to identify potential gender differences in treatment efficacy and safety. Here we have some, the figure that appears in their paper that shows some of the strategies that they are fostering. For example, I will highlight some. They talk about how it is important to produce recruitment strategies that are targeting women and gender diverse individuals. They state the need of including more women and gender diverse investigators and or coordinators on the study team. They highlight the importance of incorporating input from previous women and gender diverse individuals involved in or declining involvement in clinical trials. And they think that it would be beneficial to also ensure flexible clinical appointment schedules for on-site visits to facilitate people with caring obligations, the participation of people with caring obligations. They also have some recommendations for regulatory bodies that I find quite interesting. The first one says that they would invite regulatory bodies to require reporting of results based on or stratified by sex and gender in subgroup analysis. And this relates to what Melanie was saying before, that what gets counted counts. So it is important also that from regulatory bodies, there is this push towards investigators to also have to report the results in a sex or gender stratified way, because what gets counted counts and what does not get counted doesn't count. So this is important also. They also talk about the importance of standardizing the collection of biologic and sex and gender identity reporting, which is not standardized, and it is creating a lot of confusion when it comes to building databases, for example. Now, before we were talking about the datafication of health, it is complicated to use or to analyze also how certain databases are balanced or unbalanced when it comes to sex and gender, because the way of reporting sex and gender is not standardized, and the definitions of sex and gender are a bit fluctuating. So then it would be beneficial to standardize this collection of sex and gender when it comes to reporting. And they also consider that it would be important to increase the representation of women and minorities in leadership and decision-making bodies for regulatory agencies and pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please. The third study that I would like to present is a review that that analyzed the use of sex and gender consideration in transplant research. They conducted a broad literature review, analyzing the use of the concepts of sex and gender in the field of transplant research. This is the study that I mentioned at the beginning that stated that more than half of the papers that they reviewed were using the concepts of sex and gender interchangeably. So there is already a terminological confusion in the field of transplant research when it comes to using sex and gender. It's completely interchangeable. 57.5% of the studies were just using both in an interchangeable way. They are worried by this outcome because they know that in the context of solid organ, tissue, and cell transplantation, the sex of donors and transplant candidates and recipients has been shown to influence health outcomes. But if then we don't have the appropriate data to analyze this, it is worrying, because then the studies that are talking about sex are confounding sex and gender constantly. So it is worrying that there is this lack of analytical accuracy. They also say that there's gender differences that can be observed in organ donation patterns, in access to the waiting list, in access to transplantation, and patient participation. And they also state how sometimes both sex and gender can be relevant. For example, they consider that it is both sex and gender are relevant when it comes to interpreting the observation that female kidney transplant recipients experience a higher risk of allograft failure than males. So why is this that it can happen? So there's both reasons, biological reasons and also behavioral reasons that can be attributed to some gender stereotypes. So they say that members of the female sex may be at higher risk of experiencing immune-mediated graft injuries as a result of immune sensitization than those of the male sex, because of possible pregnancies or stronger immune reactivity or different biological phenomena. And on the other hand, gender is also important because, as they state, women could be more caring about the healing process, and also they adhere more to immune suppression. They are more constant when it comes to taking their medication. So then these are factors that are also affecting their risk of complications. So they consider that it is important, the careful consideration of sex and gender in allotransplantation and donation research that can help outline personalized strategies and to aid decisions on organ allocation and to improve transplant outcomes. These considerations can also highlight disparities in care and optimize patient experience and inform policy changes that can benefit patients ultimately. Next slide, please. So after these many considerations that we have presented you today, what can be done? So we refer again to this project, Gendered Innovations, which is quite, it is very interesting. It is quite useful when it comes to providing with useful information. And we invite you to go to their website and to have a look. They have a part that I think it's called Rethinking Concepts, and they invite to precisely this, to rethink, to assess critically the concepts that we are using in medical research, so that we can be more accurate when we are using certain terms, and also to assess when certain terms can need to be used, because not always the category of sex will be useful to know. It depends on the field of medicine that we are understanding. Sometimes it might not be important. For example, they put the example, I like this one very much, of the knee replacement that some company was marketing a knee prosthesis for women and a knee prosthesis for men, and they were wondering if sex here is a factor. Maybe sex was being used as a proxy for other things such as height, weight, etc. Maybe the categories of weight and height would be more useful to know which prosthesis a person needs than the category of sex. Sex is just some kind of like mega classification that we can use to mean, okay, shorter people that weight less, but what you need is the actual height and the actual weight of the person, not the sex. So this is just one example where we may not need the category of sex. So it is also important to assess in which moment it is necessary. That's why also we like to talk about situated knowledge, because the categories that we use need to be situated in particular practices. So here, this is an invitation to think and rethink the concepts, the background assumptions about sex and gender that we are using, and we can just try to ask ourselves certain questions to assess if we are using certain background assumptions. For example, like, do researchers in our team assume certain gender roles? Are there certain gender roles in our lab, on our research team? Are we as researchers aware of possible gender biases in our field? Do we know which kind of gender biases are present in our field of expertise? Do we as researchers assume here in this particular study that gender and sex are binary, or are we open to trying to analyze it in a different way? Do we have the data to analyze it in a different way? That's another question, but that is worth being asked. Do we as researchers take into consideration here the interactions between sex and gender and how they might affect certain health outcomes? So yeah, these can be questions to ask ourselves, so that we can try to integrate critically the categories of sex and gender into research. And with that, next slide. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you. We are done with it.
Thank you very much, both of you. Throughout this webinar, we all have learned about the real complexity of the integration of sex and gender into medical research. I mean, it's not just, okay, I'm going to conduct a research, I'm going to include male and females, then I'm going to provide discrete analysis, and that's it, I have that. No, it's so much complex than that. This is really important to be aware of this, because we all, and all the scientists and researchers want to do it better. So it's really important to, as you have highlighted, no? First of all, to think and state what is really relevant for my particular research before starting the research project. What should I include? Sex, gender, both, intersex, what is relevant for my topic, for the topic that I want to analyze or research. And then also, as you stated too, somehow think about that in each phase of the research progression, not only at the beginning, not only at the end, to do it kind of accurate all along the process. And how necessary is to prepare before the design of the research to avoid sex or gender biases, but also all along the research. And all of this, of course, to conduct better, more reliable and more accurate research. That's our goal, the goal of all the scientists and all the researchers. So PBMRI ERIC regularly share content and updates on the importance of sex and gender in medical research from their ELSI experts via the PBMRI ERIC newsletter. You can sign in up on the website www.bbmri-eric.eu. You will also find the ELSI knowledge base and help desk on the website. If you enjoyed this recording, do share it with interested friends and colleagues, and leave us a review or comment on whichever platform you tune in via. It helps to reach new audiences. Watch out for the next ELSI episode via BBMRI ERIC socials on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us. And I will now open the floor up for questions and comments. If you have any questions, please write on the chat and I will read for you.